Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is tuning in today. Welcome back to another episode of the Sunday Stream, the only show on geopolitics worth watching on a Sunday. And today I am joined, and it just feels like the other day, I am joined today by Semiagog. How are you, sir?
I am very well and happy to be with you.
Well, I'm glad that you could join us. So, for context, for those of you who are new or just tuning in, last week we had a discussion with two Polish citizens, sort of giving a everyman's Polish national perspective on the current situation that is going on in Poland and what their views are and their own domestic politics as well. And I thought that now that we sort of have their perspective, that it would be only fitting to take a look back and see the larger picture, as it were, and sort of see who else is involved, because clearly it is never just, at least in Eastern Europe, it is never just between two countries. And one thing that I think is important that we talk about when we sort of discuss Poland, Belarus, Russia, and the other parties involved is that we try our best to avoid in these kind of conversations saying things like Washington and Moscow or Minsk and Moscow and the like, because it is never just singular entities at work. Especially when we talk about, say, former Soviet states, we can't just say that these are umbrella states, because even the state actors of former Soviet republics have their own interests. And I think that that's going to be very important when we start taking a look at sort of the tense relationship between Alexander Lukashenko and Vladimir Putin of Russia as they try to lead their own respective governments. But as you can see on the screen in front of us, that we'll be going through quite a few articles and maps today, sort of trying to pin everything together and make sure that all the dots are connected as we talk about this ongoing issue and dispute. Especially as right now, as you can see on screen, that there are already growing concerns over the media perspective of this, the continuation of giving certain materials and supplies to these migrants that are coming in that have been flown in. There's plenty of evidence for that. And we'll also see how this plays a much bigger picture in relation to the other issues that, say, the West or the Atlanticist perspective has on Russia, and more particularly what also is going down in the South in Ukraine. So there's a lot for us to cover today. And Semiagog, is there a particular area that you wanted to go over first, or we just want to dive right in?
I am not entirely sure how you're going to tackle this, so it's probably best if I wait to get a sense of, how you want to start. Are you going to just gnaw at the edges, or are you going to try to leap for the heart of anything? So yeah, I'll just watch for a bit and then jump in if that's okay.
No problem. So I wanted to start with actually the issue over where this is all being done. So as many of you have seen on the news, if you've been covering this topic or you watched our stream last Sunday, there has been a very particular area in which they are sort of all focusing and funneling in. And it tends to be one of the lesser forested areas in on the Polish Belarusian border. And I will have a few maps that I wanted to share and compare so you all can kind of see what I'm talking about, because there are a lot of forested areas in the northern section of the Polish-Belarusian border that are, well known for trafficking and are well known for, smuggling drugs and people. But I'll put up here. So this is a topographical map for what we're seeing here. So it's slightly hilly and mountainous over in the Belarusian border. Not so much happening to the south, but it is mainly happening up here to the north. And this is happening mainly because there's more roads here. You do have the Koznica train line between the two countries, which a lot of interstate trade between Poland and Belarus takes place. And then within this area, it is not nearly as forested as it is, say, towards the north. So north in this area, you can see where I'm circling in between Lithuania and Belarus. It is highly forested. There's a lot of coniferous forests in the area that are well known for trafficking either migrants or other illicit and contraband goods. But we're seeing it primarily in less forested areas with just more rolling hills and plateaus. In order to have the most optimal media attention, there has been numerous articles and clips discussing the idea of, migrants, blowing cigarette smoke or their cigarettes in front of the children's eyes, so they're crying for the camera. On top of the fact that they'll have the word help written in English on their foreheads for everyone to see. So you're seeing a traditional structure of migrant politics as a weapon, similar to how President Erdogan of Turkey has been using migrants as leverage inside his negotiations with the EU, which have been ongoing for years. But since the migrant crisis from about 2015 onward, it has been going on to a significant degree. And I have this map out here because I then want to compare it to some of the ongoing areas of tension with the current crisis and where things are happening. So let me put up the other map real quick so you guys can have a good comparison. So share this one. So it's happening right below the south of the mainly forested areas and very close to the Kuznica train yard and train line between the two countries. And this is where it's happening between Belarus and Russia. This map is sort of talking about where they've seen some migrants try and get through. As we talked about last week, there has been a lot of supplies and materials given to these migrants, including everything from wire cutters to logs and sticks that have been cut down by the Belarusian border guards and police forces in order for them to try and clear the way as they put themselves out there and claim that they wish to go to Europe, and more particularly Germany and other parts of Western Europe that have been more accepting or more beneficial towards incoming migrants from the Middle East. And all of this, right, has just been the issue regarding migrants as weapons. Specifically in the past, we've seen that, Eastern European countries, whether it is Poland or Hungary, or at least not too long ago until Kurz was taken out, the Austrians as well, were all very adamant against putting themselves out there as being anti-immigrant. They're putting up border walls and border fences. And along with that, right, is that you have seen this ongoing dispute between Poland and the European Union. While Poland is the largest beneficiary of European Union money, being sort of a net negative in contributions, they're also in a position to set up their own legal battles with the European Union as well. Their constitutional court has put up the idea that self-determination and Polish law shall take supremacy over the EU, and we'll get more into that in just a bit. But I think that this is very indicative that it's not just these two countries, right? And I think that this puts us in a very good position to start talking about the relationship between Alexander Lukashenko and Vladimir Putin. Because there is a long history between the two countries since the collapse of the Soviet Union and Putin's rise to power. And I think that that's a good place to start. So let me put up a article for you all now that we can stop sharing this map, because there's a lot to talk about. In particularly would be and I'm going to put up some think tanks because they have some, at least a decent overview here. I try to avoid them, but they do provide good bean counting. Here we go. Let me find it. Perfect. So share. So this is from the Carnegie Center, or at least the Moscow version, right? You also have the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace. But it's important to realize that Belarus and Russia have kept a very close relationship in terms of economics, defense, and a common currency. Or at least that was the goal when this started out with the Union State. This came out in about, I want to say, December of 1999, I think. And the Union State was aimed at uniting both of the countries and to have a structure of a confederation or some kind of political union. Today, of course, both Belarus and Russia maintain their own independence and their own sovereignty. They govern themselves independently. This is based on previous work between Russia and Belarus in the 90s as the Russian Federation came to be versus the then, of course, collapsed Soviet Union. And the other thing to keep in mind, right, is that Alexander Lukashenko has held the position as the president of the Supreme State Council of the Union since 2000. So he's held this role for now 21 years now. They mainly focus on economic integration, which is a huge issue we'll be talking about today, defense, and the sharing of intelligence between the two countries, which I think is a really good way to understand what's happening here. Because while Lukashenko wishes to preserve his own independence, wishes to fight back against sort of the ongoing issue over European Union sanctions, he also has to toe the line between Moscow, or Russia, excuse me, at least their relationship with the Russian government, as well as their own after years of proposing economic integration and doing in doing that, right, you're also seeing this pushback, this desire to still remain somewhat sovereign as well. So all of these things that have been happening over the course of the last 20 years are all kind of coming to a head as this migrant crisis unfolds itself as sort of a retaliatory measure against European Union sanctions and a more tense relationship with Russia, despite them going back and forth on similar issues. And with that, I mean, that also tells us a lot in regards to the migrants that are being flown in. They're being flown in from Afghanistan. They're being flown in from Iraq. They're being flown in from Syria. And they're also being flown in from Turkey. And considering that, Turkey's got roughly 4.5 million people from a variety of other Middle Eastern states, you can kind of see this being used by Turkey as a sort of a pressure release valve in trying to handle these as well. And Semiagog, I was wondering if you had anything that you wanted to add there.
Yeah, a few things. If I may, like you said, they often have some interesting bean counting observations or general contextual sort of orientation passages. These various think tanks. And if I may take just a moment, there's an executive summary here over on the Jamestown Foundation, and this dates from back in January, but it's relevant. So can I take just a moment to share this background?
By all means.
Okay. This is an executive summary on an article entitled "The Belarus Factor in Kaliningrad's Security Lifeline to Russia." One thing, do you have a map, Prude, that shows sort of a pretty good picture of Europe so that we can see sort of all of Europe hanging off the side of Russia, as my friend Tim likes to say, like a vermiform appendix, like some sort of secondary organ that Russia doesn't entirely need except for its population and industrial capacity?
Yes, let me pull one up for you.
Okay, well, I'll just start reading this as you do so. So this is called, again, "The Belarus Factor in Kaliningrad Security Lifeline to Russia." Executive summary. 3 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, security ties between the Republic of Belarus and Russia's Kaliningrad Oblast exclave remain linked in important ways, even as economic transit and energy infrastructure connections have withered away over time. But since the disputed August 9th, 2020 Belarusian presidential elections, demonstrations and instability inside Belarus have sparked anxiety and concern in both Moscow and Western capitals over the future geopolitical orientation of this East European country, wedged between Russia and NATO's Baltic flank. Hypothetical, dramatic political changes inside Belarus that deeply and profoundly alter Minsk's foreign policy and geopolitical alignment would force Russia to introduce major revisions to military strategic planning on its western flank. Undoubtedly, under such a scenario, Kaliningrad, the Russian Federation's westernmost province, would be adversely affected. And though some implications, especially in the realms of bilateral trade, food, and energy security, would have only marginal bearing on the oblast, at least at first, the military political ramifications would bring profound medium to long-term changes to Russia's position in Kaliningrad. Indeed, the impact of Belarus on the Russian strategic situation in Kaliningrad has often been neglected, if not completely ignored by Western experts. And I'll just give you this quick summary paragraph. Any sudden reorientation of Belarus away from Russia would drastically transform Kaliningrad's military capabilities and marginalize many of the efforts undertaken by Moscow, especially since 2014, to restore the oblast's military potential. In terms of the transportation sector, the impact could derail Kaliningrad's economic model, which is heavily reliant on exports of manufactured goods to Russia that primarily ship via overland routes across Belarus rather than by sea. And in the scope of information ideology, one likely consequence could be the emergence and growth of separatist trends in Kaliningrad that could uproot its Russia-tied mooring, arguably Moscow's main fear regarding its Baltic exclave. Okay, so you can see there on the map very clearly where Kaliningrad is. It is an exclave. You can see that it is not connected to Russia in terms of any overland routes, except through Belarus, which is at least in theory, by the sufferance of the government in Minsk. Now, I've mentioned this on other streams before, but do you have a map that shows a little bit more of Europe so that we can see the Mediterranean as well, particularly the northern part of the Black Sea? If so, I can make this sort of last point of why this matters. You'll probably be aware of this, and many of my general viewers will be, but I just want to point this last part out because it sets the context for why Russia is concerned about Kaliningrad.
Let me get you one real quick.
Okay, as that's pulling up, let me just give you some more background here until the map comes up. Following the 2004 Belarus-Russia natural gas dispute, Kaliningrad-bound supplies of gas through Belarus were suspended, creating a panic in Moscow over the energy vulnerability of its Baltic exclave and setting in motion a series of long-term plans to insulate the oblast from any future supply disruptions via Belarusian territory. Okay, so on this map, can you move your cursor over Kaliningrad just so everybody can see where it is?
Yep.
You see that little orange spot where Prud just put his cursor. Now, can you go down to the area of Ukraine that is right by Moldova and right by Romania, the sort of edge of it? Okay, right where his cursor is there. Now, if you draw a line from that spot there up to Kaliningrad, you will notice that that's like the wasp waist of Europe. That is the narrowest point between two seas that you could draw a line between, and that is not an accident in my view. So what's happened is with NATO's expansion and the fall of the Soviet Union, so we've been told, the important thing is that Russia has had to lose a great deal of territory, and it had all of those Warsaw Pact states as buffers. But now they're not there, particularly moving into Ukraine, which was something of as many people like to observe, a breadbasket for Russia. So there's both the economic and territorial losses, the trade relationships that become affected by NATO's eastward expansion. But there is also that important thing about buffer states. So it seems very, very clear that what Russia has done is they said, well, we're going to be forced to give up this other territory. There's nothing we can do about it, but let's hang on to 2 points that mark the outer edges of that narrow wasp waist of Europe. One of them is Kaliningrad in the north, and it's important because it sort of sets them up on their own sort of right flank facing Europe with Kaliningrad. Not only does that give them the ability to move southward and eastward down towards the Black Sea across that narrowest point, it also helps them to block access to areas further up in the Baltic Sea, the sort of the region of the old Hanseatic League. So Kaliningrad is important because as a military exclave, it basically gives Russia something of a forward beachhead, a footprint. So if anything were to happen, they've already got a military installation there that, again, prevents people from coming up through the Baltic Sea and getting deeper into Russia. And it also gives them this sort of overland route to try to draw a line to close off European access. And it's no accident that it is the narrowest part of Europe there. Anybody who studied World War II, for example, knows that there were just thousands and thousands of miles long fronts between the mid-century Germans and the Russians during World War II, and they would bulge with these enormous salients as they were contesting the lines. And so Russian troops had to be deployed along a vast front. And that means that they have to correspondingly be spread that much more thinly. And so this little wasp-waisted thing is very, very important in terms of their forward planning for contingencies, because that means they could deploy troops across a much narrower space if they had to. So if you go down to the area there by the north of the Black Sea, there is not only Crimea right there, which Russia, frankly, is never going to turn loose of. Let me just go ahead and say that, because it's the base of their naval operations in the Black Sea. The Crimean War was fought over that. There is also what is their southern defensive wall, which is the Caucasus Mountains themselves, which, frankly, I mean, maybe they'll allow some games to be played on the southern faces of the Caucasus, but not on the northern, and certainly not with the old Georgian military highway that runs from Vladikavkaz down into South Ossetia. And that's where that South Ossetia conflict came in. Okay, so if you look over there just west of the Crimea, sort of in the area of Moldova and Romania and the rest there's an area called Transnistria that Russia seized and has not turned loose of. It's where the Dniester River comes out into the Black Sea. And that is their other little military arrangement there. And that gives them those 2 points. So now start thinking about Belarus. Now bear in mind what we were just talking about with the fact that Russia has to move through Belarus overland corridors to keep the Kaliningrad exclave supplied, and also to have things flow back in the other direction. And we know now that NATO is going after Crimea, is going after the whole business of Ukraine. So they're beginning to try to put pressure, or continuing, I should say, continuing to try to put pressure on Russia in this southern area. And now I would, if I had to guess, associate the events in Belarus with a play by NATO in the Baltic that Russia is forced to contend with. So the last thing here, I know I've been long-winded, but I wanted that context there. The last thing is, you can see in the Caucasus what Russia has been forced to do again, and it sort of supports my take on this, which is that as they lose their influence on former Soviet satellite states like Armenia and Azerbaijan, which are being pushed on, right? And just south of the Caucasus Mountains there's a whole set of pipelines that runs from the Caspian over to the Black Sea. We've seen games that had Turkey involved in Azerbaijan, in fighting with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. And that's still going on, by the way. Putin will, make a call and say that you guys need to sort this out. We need to have some sort of peace terms. But you'll still see news where, the leader of Armenia is saying, oh, there was a minor offensive by the Azerbaijanis today, but they haven't taken any further Armenian territory. So that's still simmering down in the bottom. And basically, when there are problems with Russia and the European countries, as well as the US, expect to see spats about Arctic access, which in this case we're not hearing much about. Expect to see spats about Kaliningrad and the Baltic states. Expect to see spats about Transnistria. Expect to see spats about the Caucasus and the Crimean Peninsula. But the last part, as I started to say with the Caucasus down there at the bottom, Russia's influence was primarily pushed out of Georgia. And so what did they do? They restored their relationships with Abkhazia, which is considered a breakaway state of Georgia, towards its west. And they pushed hard to say that they had to protect South Ossetia. And if you're not familiar with the geographic realities, you won't know that South Ossetia is that Georgian military highway, which it's the single and most important year-round road from north of the Caucasus to the south. It's like your main pass, which is why they called it the Georgian military highway. So that's what I'm trying to underscore here. They lost their indirect control over Georgia, and they said, okay, it's a fait accompli. What are we going to do about this? We can't do anything at the moment. So let's go ahead and seize the critical aspects that we need for our security. And that is the Georgian military highway, which is South Ossetia, which everybody should remember from 2008. And that is Abkhazia, which they recently just got this better relationship with. So they said, we lost the territory, but let's keep these strategic strong points, like Crimea. They lost much of the Ukraine, but they said, if we keep Crimea, we're cool. They lost much of their influence on Georgia, but they said, if we keep South Ossetia, we're cool. They lost their influence on Romania and Moldova, but they said, if we keep Transnistria, we're cool. Same things going on with Kaliningrad. And only if you look at those elements together on the map, will all the rest of this make sense? Sorry for that being long-winded, Prude, but I just wanted to get out the sort of the larger game board.
Oh, no, that was great. And in fact, to support your point on the geography, this was something that I had a map for, as well as someone in chat pointed out. So I'm going to share it real quick, because the other important thing about that being the straightest, or the shortest straight line between Kaliningrad and then to your military bases, both within the Crimean Sea, was the topography. So you can see from where Kaliningrad is all the way down here, you're not dealing with intense mountainous regions like that we would see in the Alps or other Baltic states. It is relatively flat, a few hills and plateaus, but other than that, this is a relative straight line between your
That's
two areas.
that trans-European plain that has been exploited by the Mongols, that was exploited by Napoleon, that was exploited by the mid-century Germans, and the one that produces just an enormous headache for Poles because their country happens to straddle that back and forth highway that does not have, as you so correctly pointed out here, any of those natural barriers, which just underscores the point of why it's so important to keep it at the shortest distance, because that yields, in terms of geographic realities, that yields a situation where they could concentrate their men most strongly, which they would have to do, given that that's the area without the natural barriers. And mind you, this is at the same time that Russia has dropped a fair amount of money into developing new tanks, which tanks in circumstances like this. I mean, most of the European, American, and Russian tank development over the last 50 years has been in anticipation of dealing with these huge wide open spaces, these vast geographic stretches without, that amount to like steppes that don't have, much in terms of natural barriers.
Yeah, and I mean, for further context, right, we can take a look at how this game board has been set up since the fall of the Soviet Union. And you could really start with German reunification at the beginning of the 1990s. The United States had made several promises as to convince the Soviet Union at the time that, listen, the German reunification, we can understand why that is a scare. There's been quite a bit of conflict since a unified Germany. Secondly, there was the promise that upon German entry to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, there would be no advancement eastward into former Soviet republic states. And as we have known, and many political commentators will tell you, that the worth of an American promise is not a very strong one. You could pretty much replace Perfidious Albion with Perfidious Americana. And from there, the United States, along with the growing European Union and its community, has moved eastward and eastward and eastward to a point where we have seen over the last 20 years especially has been the issue over color revolutions. I think we can recall the Orange Revolution, I believe in 2004, and in Ukraine. And we've seen numerous pushes for more democratic, I say that lightly with quotes, around issues of Belarus and Poland and Hungary, nations that are not necessarily playing the European Union Atlanticist game. And to which Russia, of course, has been very much emphasizing its focus on these two military connections and sort of securing up its main borders, whether that be the South Ossetia highway, whether that be Kaliningrad, access to the Crimean Peninsula, the sea there, as well as its bases to the east. All of which tells you that is where the line has been drawn, especially as the United States has moved forward and forward. At the current moment, as we discussed last week, there are about 4,500 American troops that have their own base of operations inside of Poland. This took place during the Trump administration's term under the request of the Polish government for an increase in funding and an increased presence there. This was on top of the fact that what was also promised was missile defense systems that have not yet come to fruition. But American technical expertise, particularly with tankers, especially as Poland remains a NATO country, illustrates that there has been ongoing posturing here. And as the board has been set up, what happens between Belarus and Poland plays a role not only with Russia's vital military interests in Kaliningrad, but also plays with the ongoing escalations and tensions between the West, quote unquote, and Russia over that of Ukraine. There has been calls for more troops and more of a NATO presence to be inside of Ukraine, and we'll touch base on that in a moment. But the big problem that you can see in this picture has been that the UK has sent troops to Ukraine. The United States, under the Biden administration, has called for Ukraine to become a member state of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This has not yet happened all the time. And all the while, right, Russia has been leveraging itself with some of its greatest assets that it can in terms of political leverage, being that of natural resources, particularly pipelines, and then secondly, its diplomatic relationships with Eastern European states based on the history, as well as for ethnic grounds and reasons. We saw that a lot as the justification for the Ukrainian referendum, or at least towards the east of the Donbass region and Russian separatists. Those are majority ethnic Russians. They speak Russian. They identify with Russia. We have to keep in mind of the old phrase, the Kievian Rus, in reference to Kiev, however you wish to call it. All of which sort of puts up the role here that we are seeing, centuries old lines of Russia sort of as a civilizational state coming to terms with what is currently going on between what we can call Russia and the Atlanticist West, after decades, right, of American promises not coming to fruition. And what has sparked really this recent tension really starts with the invasion of Georgia in 2008, to sort of secure that not only areas for where pipelines occur, but also because of Americans trying to funnel money into there. This was already after American money went in for color revolutions. The same was trying to happen with Georgia, supporting South Ossetian separatists in the area against the Russian government. And as George Friedman will tell you in his book, Flashpoints, The Emerging Crisis in Europe, that sort of really set the line for the confrontations that we've seen from about 2008 onward between Russia and the United States, NATO, and the European Union, has been that we recognize that the United States and the European Union have been pushing stronger and stronger advances towards territories that have an ethnic claim to Russia or that have been a part of the Russian civilization state since a greater Russian unification for centuries onward, and they're going to take the time to defend that. And I mean, even if you haven't read Alexander Dugin's, 1995 book, The Foundations of Geopolitics, this is something that he has outlined since, post-Soviet collapse. All of which, right, is to ensure that sort of buffer state, as well as the distances between how hard it would be for, say, NATO or the American military forces to make an advance inward. All of which is partially why we can see such tensions between Belarus and Poland today, which I think gives us a really good opportunity to transition to what has been going on. So earlier, I believe it was last week, President Alexander Lukashenko had threatened to shut off natural gas pipelines that had flow through his country into Western Europe. These pipelines, of course, are Russian pipelines. And Russia offers more or less around, I want to say 45% of the European Union's market share for where it gets its natural gas from. Now, this, of course, is very reminiscent towards both President Putin's government about the crisis that happened in Ukraine in 2009 over the pipeline shutdown that actually took place there. All of which, right, led causes for Russia to recognize, okay, we need to do more to make sure that we are not reliant on land-based transit states between us and European Union countries for energy reasons, right? Because things like natural resources, coal, timber, and natural gas are some of Russia's biggest exports, and as well as its political leverage to other countries, like that of the European Union and its member states, as well as the People's Republic of China. And because of this recent shutdown, the Germans had responded in kind, particularly as they're getting very close to sort of agreeing to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But the Germans decided to do something in response to hold back on that, which was canceling the Nord Stream 2 agreements, or at least holding them off on it with a suspension. The argument being that, well, the companies that we're working with are actually based in Switzerland. They're not based in Germany. We're going to have to review this in paperwork for a little bit. And there's some reasons for this. One, because earlier in the summer of this year, as the Americans had tried for years to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline after the success of the first one in 2012, was that they don't want this pipeline, being completed, nor the Germans agreeing to it at all. And if I recall correctly, the former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, is on the board for the Nord Stream pipelines and was primarily responsible for getting the first one off the ground. So there's already a somewhat deep political connection between the two countries, despite American pressure and influence trying to get it to stop. The American government during the Trump administration, the Obama administration, were supportive of the German Green Party in order to make sure that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was canceled. And this summer, an agreement was signed between Russia, the United States, and Germany about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which at the time was around 95% completion. And the agreement is that we would allow this pipeline to happen. and that we would allow all of this to take place and for natural gas to flow into Germany. But as long as Russia does not use it as a political weapon, then we won't sanction Russia and we won't do anything to necessarily stop the pipeline from its completion. And that was the agreement made between the three as sort of this conciliatory aspect to the United States after sort of its diplomatic failings. And the second part of that agreement was that Germany and the United States would invest roughly $1 billion in renewable energy production inside of Ukraine as sort of this conciliatory pat on the head, saying, sorry that you're going to lose out on what little transit fees and revenue that you can make off of your existing pipelines that go into the European Union, because Russia will now primarily put most of its resources on the two Nord Stream pipelines up in the Baltic Sea, connecting it from Russia to Germany. And so now, in response to Lukashenko's threats to shut it down and arguing that, listen, we're going to force your hand here, the Germans decided, no, we're not going to do anything, which is going to probably put Russia or Germany in a tight spot, as well as other EU member states here, as they focus on the fact that, oh, gas is going to be incredibly expensive, heating is going to be expensive, winter blackouts are very possible, as this article tells us up here, and this is from Fortune. Talking about how, and I'll read a little bit of it here. Germany's energy regulator suspended its certification of the highly contentious Nord Stream 2 Russia to Germany natural gas pipeline last Tuesday, a move that will add an already high geopolitical tensions between Russia and the EU. European gas futures leapt 10% on the news. The move was made by the Federal Network Agency, also just after the commodity trader Trafigura warned of power cuts in Europe this winter owing to limited gas flows arriving from Russia. They had said that they would not certify the Nord Stream 2's eponymous Gazprom-controlled operator, as it was established not in Germany, but rather in Switzerland. Quote, following a thorough examination of the documentation, the agency concluded that it would only be possible to certify an operator of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline if that operator was organized in a legal form under German law, end quote. And why is this all important? And the reason why it's important is because this is Russia's greatest sort of political leverage it has, aside from abject use of military force or investment in cooperation with, say, the Chinese. And they are now responding in kind without invoking the agreement that is in part between Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and Germany. All of which tells us that this issue is going to be expanding between not only the ongoing sort of faux climate environmentalism that we see out of Western countries, particularly led by nations like the UK, the United States, and Germany. Between those that are still taking an issue of themselves, right, would be that of like Russia and China that still are trying their best to use these, coal, natural gas things that Western and other climate scientists would tell you are damaging to the environment. Another issue, of course, right, would be reliance on, say, independent operators with the Mediterranean. For instance, Greece as their own sort of Mediterranean cooperative on natural gas exports that they've invited the Russians to be a part of, although Putin's government has claimed that it is a rival to Gazprom and their own natural gas exports and resources into the area.
And if you're not willing to believe that Russia views them as a rival, then ask yourselves why Russia has made such an investment out of keeping with its conduct for quite some time in terms of imposing its presence at Tartus on the Syrian coast there, right by Cyprus and all these other countries, Turkey and Greece and Israel, Lebanon, and the rest that are involved in the Mediterranean natural gas plays. So yeah, they're definitely concerned about it.
Yes, and that also plays in a factor with their ongoing relationship with Turkey. For centuries, right, they have not necessarily had the closest relationship. You can always think about sort of the Eastern question, or more recently, the Balkan Wars, and then the consequences of the First World War and the destruction of the Ottoman Empire that soon followed afterwards. And on top of that, right, we've seen since the migrant crisis, or at least for the last, I would say probably now 10 years from 2011 onward, which really the linchpin of that becomes the American coup attempt, right, in I believe 2015 to oust President Erdogan and install a more Western-friendly, NATO-friendly, more quote-unquote democratic leader inside of the Turkish government. And in doing so, what has happened since then, of course, is that Erdogan has consolidated power. He has purged its military. He has purged its civil service and has become what the West laments as far more autocratic and totalitarian. all of which, right, to defend the national sovereignty of the state and to prevent Western meddling in turn. Um, all of which, right, illustrates an ongoing concern about how their relationship plays out. Because as Turkey has, drifted more towards Russia, buying Russian military equipment and arms, we can definitely see how so many other, nations play a role in here. Because not only is the situation between Poland and Belarus one minor flashpoint, but it also just brings in so many other nation states that are involved. And we can see this from Germany to Turkey, to Russia's already competing interests within the Mediterranean for gas, as well as their relationship with Turkey over natural gas resources. All the while, right, this nation that you are wanting greater economic, strategic, and political integration with is sort of, throwing sand in your eye, so to speak, as all of a sudden the leverage that you do have is being responded to in kind over Lukashenko's threats, because despite their relationship, it is not as easy or as easygoing as it once was. And yeah, let me pull up a few more articles, but if you had anything to add, Semyagog, by all means.
Yeah, just in terms of the general picture, I was just taking a look here to see if I could figure out, and I had to jump back to turn off my mute. But you mentioned George Friedman, and he's the Stratfor geopolitics wonk, glowy, and
Yeah.
and I can't remember exactly when he published that book. If you happen to know, I'd be interested to hear, Prude, that one about the coming conflict in Europe.
It came out in February of 2016. It's called Flashpoints: The Emerging Crisis in Europe. And in that book, I have a whole stream on it if you're interested as well, just talking about the main points, where it's basically saying here are some age-old historical issues that have been plaguing the European continent for centuries, whether it's rivalries, the Russian civilizational state. And he sort of points to the financial crisis and the invasion of Georgia as these flashpoints that have started to cause tensions throughout the continent that he thinks is the reason why the European Union is not long for this earth. And surprisingly, it lays a pretty heavy-handed criticism of liberalism.
Yeah, if you've been following Friedman for any time, you'll know that he had a little operation he started called Stratfor, which was sort of pushed forward and surfaced by his backers. And for those who know, Stratfor sort of rocketed into international attention, and the site started to get traffic and sort of made a name for itself, and correspondingly elevated Friedman's profile during the war in Yugoslavia, and the bombing of Belgrade. And I think it's very important to bring that up at this point, because, you had talked about when a lot of this started, and I would argue that it started with the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia. So you can think of Kaliningrad as a kind of exclave, and of course it is, with military stuff and the rest. It's a Russian military oblast, right? However, Russia has other exclaves that are more informal, and the Balkans, Serbia in particular, is one of them. And I noticed that some people in the chat were pointing it out, that there are issues with the Balkans, and there may well soon be problems with Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, I have not looked specifically at Bosnia-Herzegovina, but that makes perfect sense, because the reality is that Putin still does have relationships in Belgrade, and they're long-standing historical relationships. For those people who are alive at the time, everybody will remember that the Serbs were cheering in the streets when Russian troops dropped in at Belgrade to defend the airport, and that was sort of the first of the major moves early in this phase of the Great Game, by NATO players to assert their dominance over areas where historically Russia had had some degree of control. And of course, they used their usual game of Muslim quote unquote freedom fighters, which of course just means Western mercenaries. And today, all a Muslim terrorist or Muslim, militia organization, everyone who ever hears that term should just immediately know they're just talking about mercenaries. They're just different names for mercenary groups that are paid by the various nations to prosecute their interests within the war zones with plausible deniability. So anyway, for those who were around at the time when the Russian paratroopers dropped into Belgrade to defend the airport, That's when Yeltsin fell. And that's also when Putin rose, because it was, so to speak, the Russians saying, "Okay, we've had enough of this guy sitting in the front, as our front man, Yeltsin." And whenever it seemed like there might be a problem, Yeltsin was, started to talk about how he might have a heart attack, and everyone would worry that the Western little installed puppet figure would fall. Finally, the Russians got sick of it. They said, "Look, this is sort of a red line for us, moving to take Belgrade, so we're going to intervene directly." And suddenly, Yeltsin just disappears. And Putin, former FSB guy from East Germany, rockets to the top. He's still in power. This game is still going on. This is when Yeltsin disappeared. This is when Putin appeared. And coming back to Stratfor and Friedman, they made their name because there was a U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And Stratfor published maps and things that showed that everything wasn't as the United States was claiming. And so I would argue that this all really starts with Belgrade. And so coming back to our old, to the thing that we were talking about a little bit earlier on in the presentation, when I pointed out Kaliningrad, I pointed out the Crimean Peninsula. We talked about Donetsk and Luhansk and the Donbass in the eastern parts of Ukraine, which are also, it's a major industrial center, which everybody should remember too, though it's been shattered. We talked about Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria. All of those are little areas where Russia has said, look, we can't keep everything. We're not going to waste our resources. We're going to keep our strong points, like the one I just pointed out with Kaliningrad, and with Transnistria. They basically got a footing there, a beachhead. So if they had to do their pincer movement across that narrow space, they could do it. What else do they have? They still have relationships in Serbia. Who is going after the Balkans like crazy? Soros. If you take a look, there's a New York Times article that was published, or rather written and then published by the Times, I believe on their opinion page, by Soros's son, Alex Soros, talking about how the EU would have to move into the Balkans and stabilize it. And the next big front where they would have to do things is the Balkans. So again, as I emphasized before, we've got to look at this map with its various pieces all at once. So it is absolutely not a coincidence. It's like my friend Tim used to say, I don't believe in coincidences. He'd say, I'm about as trusting as the average tarantula. There's no such thing as a fucking coincidence. Do you think it's a coincidence that there's a destabilization and sort of an increase of the temperature with the frozen conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh with the Armenians and Azeris? I'd be interested from people who might be in Georgia. I'd be interested to hear from them what's going on there, whether there's squeaking and peeps in the background about stuff that might happen there. We've got this stuff going on in Belarus now. At the same time, we've got Russians massing on the border with Ukraine, so we're told, with the prospect of invasion. I would expect, given that we must look at all these elements at once, because none of them exist in isolation, I would expect to see things break out with Serbia and the Balkans in some fashion, because that is a place in theory where the Russians can still pull a lever and say, okay, you want to create problems in our backyard. What are you going to do when we pull our lever and you've got them to confront in your backyard? And if we start doing anything in the Balkans, then you start messing around with the idea of Muslim and Christian populations. And if you start to rattle that cage at a time when you've got rioting based on lockdowns, where immigrant populations that are less tolerant of that kind of nonsense are heavily overrepresented, it could get very, very interesting. And then there's just a last couple points here I'll throw in and I'll be quiet. On the border between Poland and Belarus recently, let's see, as of 2 days ago, it looks like the riots, these reports are saying, riots at the Kuznica or Kuznica Brudzki border crossing that Prudentialist showed you guys at the opening of the presentation. They're saying that someone seriously damaged the internet cable connecting Belarus to Western internet resources. So Belarusian users may now have problems accessing them, says Belarus's state provider, Bell Telecom. Oh, that's interesting. Internet cut off at a time when you might expect Westerners to get involved with color revolutions. And we've seen since the days of the quote unquote Arab Spring, where you had like glowy Facebook texts and the rest involved with, organizing groups of protesters in places as far afield as Syria to Tunisia and Egypt. We've also got a notice from 3 days ago. Poland is saying that it may close the rail border crossing in Kuznitsa. So there's a lot going on in the background here, and we can see that that they're talking about cutting things off. Right now, they're talking about cutting of internet service. They're talking about cutting rail lines. So you must understand, everyone listening must understand that this is under the model of unrestricted warfare. This is a territorial war, and it's being fought between NATO powers and the Russian bloc. And I think that there's a very strong wild card in here of China, because they've been attempting to have an ongoing relationship with any kind of Three Seas initiative that emerges, or any kind of Visegrad group thing. And as people from Poland pointed out to me in the past, Poland has a long-standing relationship of trade with China from the days of the Warsaw Pact. And I think it's no accident. I don't know the background story behind it, but I think it's no accident that when all of this really did start, this latest phase of it in Belgrade, that it was Russia versus NATO, that Yeltsin disappeared, that Putin appeared, and golly, it just seems like such a strange coincidence. One of the biggest scandals that emerged out of it was the bombing of the Chinese embassy. So these are the elements that we have to think of at once. We must understand that this is a kind of warfare that is just not yet fully kinetic. And we're seeing things like cutting off access, talking about cutting rail lines, the prospect of losing overland access to the Kaliningrad Oblast for the Russians, internet going out, train crossings being cut off. And what are we seeing? The moving around of migrants. And as I said, everybody has to understand that those are mercenary armies. They're not just militias or migrants. They are the militias themselves, or the quote unquote terrorist groups, are just mercenary forces. And we know that they move within so-called refugee populations. So there is a lot going on here in the background, and you have to look at the various pieces all at once. You cannot just look at Belarus or South Ossetia or the Donbass. All of these things must be conceived of at one time in order to even have a chance of guessing about what might be afoot.
Exactly, and I think that this gives us a good transition into China, because the recent events that have been happening in the Baltic region has allowed China to sort of get more involved in this area. So, bordering, of course, Belarus and the area that we're discussing, right, is the issue of Lithuania, which borders Poland as well. And Lithuania recently, earlier this week, I believe, had opened up a diplomatic office between Lithuania and the Taiwanese. It is not an official recognition of nationhood. It is not an official recognition of Taiwan's independence from China, but rather it is a lower level sort of way, in the same way that, say, the United Kingdom and the United States recognized Taiwan, not as an official statehood and not proposing United Nations membership as a recognized country, but still wants to maintain independent diplomatic relations that sort of veer away from the existing one China policy that the United States has been practicing since 1979. And China, of course, like has been mentioned, has been trying their best to, have a foothold in that area, especially because China has been interested in being involved, as Semyagog had mentioned, in the Three Seas initiative. As we've talked about in an earlier episode in regards to the Arctic Circle, China wants to have a closer relationship with Russia for access to potential future sea routes that may be for trade. Keep in mind that Russia is the largest possessor of nuclear-powered icebreakers. They are the only country on Earth using nuclear-powered icebreakers. The United States has not yet even produced one. They have one on there, and they're producing, I believe, 6 more on the way, and still have the largest fleet that can do it that are diesel-powered. And so China has been heavily interested in how they can have access to the Baltic Sea and in turn move upwards towards the Arctic Circle. Because while they are not a member or a permanent member of the Arctic Council, nations that have access to the Arctic Circle and thus discuss issues of trade, maritime disputes, and navigation, they are a observing state and are allowed in to discuss this issue. And so what a better way than to sort of get your foot in the door after, attempts at normalizing trade relations between Belarus and China has not necessarily been working together. And in fact, even, various other organizations like the Center for European Policy Analysis had talked about that Lukashenko had put a strategic bet on China back in the early 21st century was aimed at reducing Belarus's dependence on Russia. Seeing an extraordinary openness to cooperation, China used Belarus as an important laboratory of the Belt and Road Initiative, or Pakistan in Europe, as it was described. But the current problems of Lukashenko's regime and Russia's increasing appetite for deeper integration provided a defining testing point for China's strategic intentions towards the region. Contrary to Lukashenko's calculations, China gave Russia a free hand by recognizing its self-proclaimed sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Continuing in quote, China's economic presence in the region has been steadily growing since the late 2000s, with Belarus clearly becoming China's primary partner. There were several elements in the relationship that appealed to China. It saw potential production hubs within Eurasia's Economic Union, the EEU, and a state-led economy potentially willing to reform according to the Chinese blueprint. The relationship was also driven by ideological affection between the two autocracies. You already see the bias here within the analysis. Lukashenko has visited Beijing 12 times, and the Belarus-China relationships were dubbed the Iron Brotherhood by propaganda outlets both in the West and European or East Asian outlets. And since then, China has been trying to increase its relationship in there with Russia, which, as Semyagog and I have discussed on numerous streams before this one, that we are both somewhat in agreement that the cozy relationship between Russia and China is not as cozy as people think it should be. And the evidence for that is both inside its relationship with Belarus, despite claiming its sphere of influence, but now getting involved in Lithuania. And then secondly, its growing interest and involvement in sort of the Eurasian sphere in the Middle East, particularly with Afghanistan, as it looks to expand its Belt and Road Initiative to get access to Turkey, or at least Iran, to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, all of which is trying to increase China's own position as a regional and global hegemon. We're pretty much right in Russia's backyard, both inside Eastern Europe, but as well as below, and sort of the Eurasian area and subcontinent, if you wish to call it that. So we can see with China, right, that they're also adamant and they've called for Belarus to resolve this migrant issue. When we talk about unrestricted warfare, one of the first few lines that you will see in that writing is that these are the same people that are willing to call, an austere religious scholar like bin Laden and George Soros a terrorist in the same sentence. And they sort of recognize the moneyed interest of what you could call democratic elitism, and how that influences Western Atlanticist non-governmental organizational policy on a supranational scale. So this isn't just one country. This is a variety and a collection of states. This is why you see arguments in the West for greater economic and political integration. This is why we could see during the Brexit days, individuals like Guy Verhofstadt lament that countries wish to preserve their sovereignty over greater integration and cooperation, sort of this abolition of what a nation is. And China has been increasingly interested in this relationship, especially as they now sort of have the perfect reason to be more involved in that area. So outside of the Taiwanese representative office inside of Lithuania, China has been also increasing its investment within the Baltic regions, whether that be inside of Belarus, as we previously had discussed, but other nations in that area as well. And all of which puts it in an awkward position. Estonia has received funding, so has Latvia. So Russia, while not as involved in the region as it probably wants to be for its own sake of getting the rest of the European continent to more sway its way away from the West, you are seeing a growing interest in using Taiwan as sort of the perfect example to get involved. And this puts it in a very interesting position because, of course, this is Russia's near abroad. This is Russia's sphere of influence, as even the Chinese have put themselves out there to call it. And even now, this border crisis in the neighboring states give China a foot in the door, so to speak, on methods and ways to further advance their own economic and strategic interests in the area, whether that be for natural resources or just for greater political influence away from Russia and the European Union.
And can I throw in another potential thing that we should sort of keep in mind?
Yes, of
Um,
course.
can you put up a map of Europe that shows the national borders, if you don't
Yes.
mind? You know that everybody is talking about the likelihood that messes will begin to get uglier in the Ukraine, and I've looked at that recently, and you can see that there are continuing issues in the east. You know, they're not any big deal, but it'll be like, you know, Russian forces fired an RPG, or, you know, Russian-backed separatists in the Donbass fired on, you know, one Ukrainian soldier lost, that kind of thing. Okay, so if you look at where Belarus is, right, and you look at the relative to the Ukraine, you can see that it borders the Ukraine to the north. And of course, Russia is over there surrounding most of the eastern Ukraine, and it bottles in the Ukraine with Crimea in the south. And with the little Transnistria arrangement over on the edge, it's getting closer into the Iron Gates and Central Europe there. So much of Ukraine is surrounded by Russia. Belarus is still, you know, whatever you may think or say about Lukashenko's position, he's still a client state of Russia, no doubt about it. And so I just wanted to throw one last thing in here that's interesting. If you look at that idea of surrounding the Ukraine, if you look at that idea of the possibility of things getting interesting in the near future with Ukraine, and also, if you think about the massive number of Muslim immigrants that are in Europe and the potential, the massive potential for instability there, that many of us have been watching now for years. I mean, I think I started looking at the potential for problems there with my friend Tim in 2015. So we've all been looking for like 6 years and noting that all kinds of things could get ugly. So let's jump around to this thing, which is a news report. This is from 3 days ago. It says that 15 migrants tried to get to the Ukraine from Belarus by bus from Minsk. Well, that's interesting. That means they're flying, that the Belarus government, which is a client of Russia, is flying in tons of migrants, and they're putting them on the border, and, you know, causing headlines and trouble over with Poland, at the same time that internet connections are being cut off in Belarus. And, you know, they claim a migrant must have cut the internet line. And I'm like, yeah, right. I was born at night, but not last night. But it perfectly suits Belarus to have that line cut, because then they can say, oh, you're not getting any internet service from the West. It's the fault of some migrant who cut the line, when in fact it could be seen as defense against the color revolution, which means Lukashenko is worried about Soros type people doing color revolution type stuff in Belarus. And meanwhile, some of these migrants that are being flown in are going down to the border and trying to cross into Ukraine. That's interesting, especially if we think about how migrants and the militia groups that move among them are essentially just international mercenaries. I mean, you could even have people who aren't even from the Middle East or Muslims at all that are moving in these groups as you know, as a kind of cover to get around and do things. Now, there's one last thing I want to point out here, which is that there's also a headline. This is from 3 days ago. It says Iraqi immigrants from Belarus arrive at Erbil Airport in Kurdistan. So it does occur to me that there's also the possibility that these so-called migrants being moved up into places like Belarus, and then apparently, according to news reports, some of them are trying to cross the southern border from Belarus into the Ukraine, and then other ones are getting flown over to Iraq, and we don't know where they first came from. You know, Turkey has a long-standing a tradition of using irregular forces like başıbozuks, or you know, irregular half bandits. They've been doing it in Afrin in northern Syria. They've been doing it in whatever the hell that damn city's name is there on the coast in Syria, that is such a mess currently. Uh, yeah, for whatever reason, the name is escaping me, but Idlib, that's what it is. And the Turks have also been flying troops, these irregular troops, these so-called Muslim terrorist organizations, which are really just mercenary militias. They've been flying them over to Libya to pursue their interests there. And we know some of these migrants that are being flown into Belarus are coming from Syria. which means they could be pulled from Russians, they could be pulled from Russian-controlled territory, and they could be clients of Russians. They could be being pulled from Turkish-controlled territory. They could be clients of the Turks. But then they're landing in Belarus, and some of them are being flown from there onward to Iraq and Kurdistan. That's odd. Wow, wacky. And then some of them are trying to cross the border and getting caught, and you wonder how many have crossed the border and not been caught into Ukraine. So I don't know what all of that means, but this is another potential dimension in terms of destabilization, in terms of providing cover for forces to be moved around, that we should all bear in mind.
Indeed, and the other thing to add on to that is that while other airlines have been sanctioned by the United States and the European Union, there has one that has been threatened but not yet sanctioned, and that one, of course, would be Belavia, which is the main airline out of Belarus. And if you can recall from earlier this year, that while the Belarusian government and the state were receiving massive sanctions from the European Union over unrests over its election and crackdown on dissidents and, putting down dissident journalists within their own airspace, that who was the first person to give Belarus a line of credit in order to keep things going? It was the Russians. The Russian government had gave them a $500 million loan in order to, take the brunt of these sanctions. So we do know that regardless of the relationship, however tense it may be as Lukashenko tries to go back to Russia after years of resisting further economic integration, that the Russians are going to do what they can to prop up this state. And they will do it in order to maintain the flow and the airline for Belavia to continue to fly these people in. Because it doesn't matter if places like Air Jordan or Air Egypt or any other Middle Eastern airline is sanctioned or stops flights into Minsk and under threat of sanction. All of which, right, doesn't matter because the main Belarusian airline is still going to be flying these rather irregular, militias of peace to wherever they need be. And as we talked about last week on the stream, when we were talking to a few Polish gentlemen, was that the Russians are ready to do what they can to defend not only Belarusian sovereignty and territory, but also their own interests in Ukraine. And what I am going to share is an image of a Russian warplane that you should probably already be familiar with, but if you haven't, here it is. This is a Tupolev Tu-22M3M. This is one of their mainline strike bombers, and this is a nuclear weapons-capable delivery device that has been recently flying over Belarusian airspace for the last 2 weeks now. They have also deployed paratroopers, as the image I have for the thumbnail will tell you this week, talking about how they are going to do what they can to defend their own territorial sovereignty, but also to defend Belarus from the ongoing calls that the Polish government has had against, Russia by calling for more forces from NATO to take a greater step. This is on top of the fact that, certain governments inside the European Union, such as that is France and Germany, have called for greater lines of cooperation and communication. And in fact, the outgoing Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has been called upon to have a conversation between Putin, Lukashenko, and herself before finally leaving office once a government is formed, to which has not necessarily been used to, it hasn't fallen and has fallen on deaf ears, so to speak. There's not yet been that conversation. But what does make things very interesting is despite all of this, right, is the hedging of bets, so to speak, that I find rather important because earlier this year, and I think it was not too long ago, yes, it was just a couple of days ago, this is where the Putin is sort of hedging his bets, so to speak. This was from Reuters on November 19th, so just the other day, last Friday. And it says, Putin says that Lukashenko should start a dialogue with Belarusian opposition. This says Moscow, November 19th, Reuters. The Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday called for Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko to start a dialogue with his opponents, who swiftly poured cold water on the idea unless Lukashenko freed political prisoners first. Putin helped Lukashenko ride out mass street protests after a disputed election last year and has also backed Belarus in a standoff with the European Union over thousands of migrants stranded on the EU's eastern borders. But the two leaders have quickly endured a prickly relationship over the years, despite Lukashenko leaning on cheap Russian energy supplies and loans to prop up his rule. Putin had said, "We know that the situation in Belarus has calmed down inside the country, but still are problems, and we are perfectly aware of that. And of course, we appeal for dialogue between authorities and the opposition. But for its part, Russia will definitely continue its approach of strengthening ties and deepening the process of integration with Belarus," end quote. And this is sort of to not necessarily be as reliant on Russia's blood and treasure to sort of ease off from supplying the European, make sure that Belarus is no longer, reliant on Russia's, loans of credit and loans that are available in order to, prop up Belarus in order to maintain sort of, Belarus's independence and to function on its own. All at the while trying to throw a bone to the EU, so to speak, saying like, listen, we're willing to play this game with you, the great game of, democratization and sort of this Atlanticist perspective, but don't think for a second that we aren't willing to defend our own territorial sovereignty and our own interests, especially as we saw earlier this year, right, where the United Kingdom had sent in a ship towards the contested area within the Crimean Peninsula and was quickly turned back after a few shots were fired. So there is already a clear game that is willing to be played here by the Russians, and it's not going to be a pretty one if it comes to that.
Yeah, and everybody should bear in mind the example of Tito and Yugoslavia when you're looking at Lukashenko. Of course, Lukashenko has to say that he's all about standing on his own because the very nature of his continued existence is a balancing act. Absolutely. And, you could talk about how, Belarus has developed in some senses. It sort of seems to be back in the sort of Warsaw Pact mindset, but it's also got a little bit more integration with the NATO countries or trade and, interactions so it's a straddling act. It's a fence riding act, and it's always a dangerous one where you have to constantly proclaim your desire for independence in order not to be characterized as a creature of one side or the other. And that's why I brought up Tito, because during the whole period of the Warsaw Pact and the rest, Tito, Yugoslavia actually was doing quite well economically compared to many of the other sort of communist nations. And at the same time, the country also played a critical role as a kind of bridge between East and West. You'd have people from what's today Croatia heading over to the border to be able to trade with the Italians. It was a little bit easier for people in Yugoslavia to go back and forth than, for example, someone coming from Russia at the time when it was difficult to leave that country, get a visa and go westward. Then take a look at Ukraine, which has now been forced into into a very ugly situation of straddling East and West. And now you've got Belarus. And believe me, Lukashenko is familiar with the history and can look at what happened to Tito's Yugoslavia and how it's been parceled up and how it is still to this day continues to have all kinds of latent problems there. As Dr. Pohl just pointed out, there's the whole idea of the non-aligned movement, which is essentially a fence-sitting movement. And Yugoslavia was a leader in that. But I would suggest that it's a surface treatment. And any discussions by Lukashenko of how he's going to free himself from Putin or whatever is literally like you should just laugh until snot comes out your nose, because it's not going to happen. I'm not saying that he's not driven by his own national interest in the rest, but he's like a piece of bread that knows that it has to be buttered on both sides, So I'd be keeping an eye on that as well. Any claims by Lukashenko that he's going to free himself from Putin's influence are Putin laughs at those probably almost as loud as those claims, almost as loud as Lukashenko himself does.
Yes, and on top of that, you also have the ongoing sort of he said, she said of, one hand waving one thing, another hand, potentially waving a fist. Wherein, of course, from our favorite, Jeff Bezos owned newspaper, The Washington Post, is talking about the ongoing calls from the Polish government about how, despite their, agreements with Belarus about repatriation flights, that there are still going to be, more migrants upon their borders. And it says that, and I'll quote it here, Lukashenko briefed the Russian leader on Friday on measures taken by Minsk to de-escalate the crisis and to give humanitarian aid to the immigrants, the Kremlin said, condemning Poland for blocking entry of migrants. The first repatriation flight carried some 430 migrants to Iraq on Thursday, according to the Iraqi Foreign Ministry. It was the first concrete sign that Lukashenko was willing to ease a crisis in Europe that they accuse him of orchestrating. But the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that the standoff over migrants continues and that no solution has yet been found to end the crisis. He urged European leaders to talk to Lukashenko. Of course, communication between Lukashenko and Putin is not enough to find a solution to the crisis, Peskov said. While Russian authorities continue to accuse Belarus on Friday of continuing to incite tensions on the border by pushing large groups of migrants to push and cross into Poland. And I'll leave it there. This goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning about sort of the topographical and forestry map between the two countries, is that this is happening in a very visible place. It's not nearly as forested as the northern part of the border between Belarus and Poland. This is to maximize the amount of attention that this is being given. This allows the media to maintain its focus on there. And is, of course, with any, sort of trick or magic act that might be shown to you, is going to be always focus on one hand with the distraction moving around and don't pay attention to the other. Because while there's a lot of media focus on here, I think that what Semyagog and I have been able to tell you today is that there is a lot more going on behind the scenes than what the media is calling out for or what Belarus is saying. And what has the EU done in all of this time about responding to this ongoing crisis? Well, they do what they usually do, is that they write a paper, and that's what is going to be their policy. And as the European edition of Politico magazine talked about just earlier this week, that their proposition is a document of 28 pages about a plan of creating a rapid European Union deployment force starting as soon as 2025, updating itself from the original idea in 1999 to create a force as strong as upwards to 60,000 troops. And this is after years of calling from the French as well as the Germans for greater European defense autonomy to focus themselves not so much on the United States, but their own, interests as a sort of neo-functionalist supranational state inside of the Western European continent, moving ever further and further east. So while one hand is saying that we'll cooperate, communicate, and repatriate, we know that they are moving down towards Ukraine. We know that there have been arrests of Western journalists in the area. I believe a German journalist was recently arrested earlier this week for trying to provide pathways for migrants to cross into the Polish border. And a few have managed to get through, but have been sufficiently detained as well. And in fact, while Russia is working their best to move them into strategic locations, there have also been numerous camps and centers set up for migrants that are currently waiting for orders, you could say, so to speak, of where they're going to go next. So they're all sitting there in Minsk, kind of awaiting and standing by.
Yeah, there's also the business of what this does domestically for Poland. You can say that this is intended to put pressure on the EU. The idea that Putin, at a minimum, has said, "Go ahead and do it. I won't stop you." At a minimum, has said that to Lukashenko, or I imagine it wouldn't be happening, because I'm not a big believer that Lukashenko has enormous free reign to do things beyond what Putin would accept. So if we go with this hypothesis that Putin has at least offered his tacit endorsement of what's happening there, or has agreed to look the other way, then you have to ask yourself, well, what does this do? What do a bunch of, I don't know, a few thousand at this point, so-called migrants on the border really do? We've talked about how it could provide cover for moving some of these members of these groups around, because you could take a bunch of militia members and fly them into Belarus, and then put them on another plane and fly them back to Kurdistan, for example. And there is probably something of that sort going on, if I had to guess, and I'm just guessing. But we have to ask, well, what about the actual focus of attention on the border with the migrants? What does that do? Hold it up like an object, turn it in the light, look at its different facets. What does it do? Now, I haven't been following this closely, but it obviously has to provide an embarrassment for the European Union. But more importantly, I think it helps Poland. I mean, if I just had to look at Polish domestic politics, I would have to say that the threat of migrants crossing the border, and if you can catch a photograph of one of them waving a shovel, it looks bad. It looks like he's aggressive. It looks like they're trying to cross over into Poland. That sounds to me like something that would very, very much play into Polish domestic politics in terms of the center right group that's in power there at present. Again, I'm just guessing. Maybe there's somebody in the chat who's in Poland now who can tell us more about it. But this seems to me like Putin via Lukashenko doing things that actually help the Poles. So what is this going to do? It either requires Poland to ask for more NATO assistance, and Russia probably doesn't want much of that. However, because the EU is what it is, it's being put in an embarrassing position where it's saying, well, we don't want to, I'm Angela Merkel. I come from, Eastern Germany from back in the day. I did a lot of my study in school when I was coming up in the Russian language. I speak Russian fluently. I'm known for my stance of trying to keep this, calm relationship with Russia. And Poland is a central part of the EU bordering these sort of Russian territories as it does. And they've got a strong domestic sense that they want to be protected. Now, Merkel, have to deal, and the rest of the weird little quislings and mandarins in Brussels, they now have to deal with the fact that Polish newspapers can run headlines about mass migrants on their border throwing rocks at their police. That looks bad. So what are they going to do? Well, Poland is in one of two positions. It can say, well, you can't blame us for getting NATO assistance here because look at what's happening. And there's this instability on our borders, and this could spill over to us. And we don't want to take migrants. It strengthens the domestic position of the center-right government that's in power there. And so what are the options that Merkel can do? She can either say, okay, yeah, I guess there is a reason why we need more NATO stuff there. Or as Prude is saying here, they can say, oh, this is just a shot in the arm for us needing to have a European quick reaction force of our own. We must develop an army of our own. And that would play into the hands of China. That would play into the hands of Russia. And it would frustrate the sort of NATO alliance. And certainly there are aspects of that all overlap, but we at least have to take into account and try to come up with some hypotheses to explain why this would be going on the Polish border, and to address this idea that it would help Poland, but it would do so in a way, it would help the position of the current Polish government in terms of their negotiation with the EU, and then create a forking path that's either more NATO involvement or more stronger calls for a European army of their own. We at least have to think about that.
Yeah, we do. And one thing to note, right, with both with Poland in its domestic politics and Germany has been how quick the turnaround has been in the relationship between the two countries. The anti-European Union stance has been beneficial, especially as the Peace and Justice Party, the Peace, has been, the one primarily in power for a significant portion of time. I can remember them winning a pretty big election, and they've managed to maintain power more or less, I think, since around 2016. And from there, we've also seen that ongoing, kerfuffle, or at least divide, between them and the European Union. But 2 weeks ago, there was an article in Der Bild which talked about, thank you, Poland, was the headline. And it was just saying, like, we're thankful that you're doing this. We're so glad that you were. And then almost as if they got marching orders, just a week or so later, there were protests and marches in Poland, and I believe in Munich, that were advocating that, hey, we should let these people in, that we shouldn't have crossings, and we should be more welcoming to migrants. However astroturfed that may be, that those events did take place. And of course, those do have a role to play with the future German government, because a new one has yet to be formed. But if there is one thing that we can take away about the domestic politics of this, was that a spokesperson earlier this week for the SPD, the Social Democratic Party that has won a sort of the leading majority that will probably form a coalition government inside of the next, German Bundestag, or at least its government, They have said that their foreign policy will stay more or less the same, which probably means more positions for European defense autonomy, more aspects of being against Russia, so to speak, and against their actions and machinations there, and more open to accepting of migrants, which is how it seems almost in perfect tandem that you see the largest governing election winner advocating for more or less the same when it comes to foreign policy. More of these seemingly 180 spins from "thank you Poland" to "let them in" at the same time. All of which, right, gives sort of Poland this nice advantage, but it does, as Semiagog was talking about, it puts it into an awkward position where you have two choices. You can either try and continue and forge your own path, or you can continue to rely on the NATO money, the American pressure, the European Union pressure, all in which they're and so it's trying to provoke sort of this similar quarrel, right, that we've seen between the EU and Hungary. And I think we're also going to see migrants being used as with EU and Poland, this sort of political divide, leaving these Eastern European states relatively politically isolated because they do not fall in line with the liberal project of the European Union when it comes to migrants and national sovereignty, while also facing, of course, um, the pause, so to speak, of the overarching American influence that still exists through in NATO and American foreign aid and its investment in these projects and other various non-governmental organizations in there, all of which is putting them in a position to where it is either confrontation or isolation, which means potentially turning its way back and looking towards the east instead of the west for economic cooperation and diplomatic communication, not with the European Union as much as it once had, but instead maybe Russia, which is a push again back towards territory and buffer states, like we mentioned at the beginning of the stream.
And do you have any sense of what the official position is and what kind of statements are coming out of the governments in Beijing and in DC? Because I didn't have a chance to look at that.
I know that the American government has called for more communication. They've sort of towed the standard line about threatening sanctions on Belarus and its government, and more from what they had done earlier this year and last year. As for Beijing, I can pull up a statement if you don't mind, but just giving me a second here. But I know that the American government has been pushing strongly for communication between NATO itself and Poland. They're trying to find a non-aggressive solution, so to speak, especially with most of the attention that the government apparatus that we see here in the United States. There has been numerous op-eds that I've seen, right, that have been talking about don't distract yourself about the focus on Taiwan and the Pacific when we should really be focused on Ukraine. I've seen 3 or 4 articles this week talking about that. So I would expect in full and kind that despite these threats of sanctions, despite the calls for a diplomatic solution, that there will be more movement within the American military in this region. But if there's anything that you wanted to add, let me find the Beijing statement while you're talking.
Yeah, I don't know. I just without proper information, I just have to guess based on sort of the basic picture that I threw out there. On the one hand, if Belarus is isolated from the West through some action of the State Department or whatever, then it just pushes it more firmly into the hands of Russia. If the stuff that goes on the border serves to alarm the Polish electorate and make them say, yeah, we have to get even more hardcore right wing to make sure that our borders aren't overrun. That could be one thing where Putin is saying, look, we can weaken your position, Mr. EU, within Poland by inflaming the very concerns that drive that voter base that doesn't want the full integration with you because of the question of migrants. Then there's the issue of whether or not this can be used as a pretext for further NATO intervention, which you would imagine the U.S. would just jump right on that. You can say, as I've mentioned earlier, that this becomes a pretext for the French and Germans with their closer cooperation and their idea of an EU army. It could be that it gets split down the middle, and China tries to come in as some kind of a third player in the region, doing its thing of economics and not military, and pushes their way up into Eastern and even potentially Central Europe. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's happening there, and we'd have to look to signals to see. But I would guess that it's going to be tied with Ukraine, because one last possibility is to say, look, here we have a situation where Lukashenko is still in power. The state hasn't entirely crumbled. Nobody has put on a full color revolution yet. But I have to say, if we're going to guess about whether or not there's a color revolution planned for Belarus, the answer would be yes. Obviously, we got this business of them cutting off the internet cable and saying, "Oh, some migrant just cut our cable," so suddenly you can't get Western media in Belarus. That's a pretty clear signal. So with the migrants marshaled on the border there, even while Belarus is still, relatively stable, you could be looking at Russia saying basically like, look, we're about to have all kinds of stuff break out in the Ukraine. If you guys try to do some provocation there, we've got our troops massed on the border. Just imagine what kind of massive refugee influx you'd have coming out of Ukraine if that happened. Because of course Poland has already absorbed a huge number of refugees from the Ukraine that they see as like a kind of a sister country with these long-standing relationships, dynasties that once ruled parts of both territories, etc. So if something's about to go down in the Ukraine, then maybe somebody out there, Europeans, Americans, Chinese, Russians, who knows, is saying, even though Lukashenko is still in power and the country is, relatively speaking, still stable, look at how you got people lined up on your borders. If things go sideways in Ukraine, we could pull levers so that Poland is dealing with a massive influx of migrants from a further war in the Ukraine at the same time as things get weird in Belarus. And now you've got to defend sort of two areas of your border. There's going to be more pressure on you. It could simply be some sort of calculus like that. But again, these are all just, sloppy guesses in the absence of further information.
So while there hasn't been too much of I can't really find an official statement, I can give you some of the signals that we can tell over the last year that I think paints a really good picture about what the Chinese might be doing in reference to this region and the crisis. So keep in mind, throughout the last few years, especially when Trump was in office, about the push to move away from Huawei on 5G dependency, you did not get a lot of success from the European Union to sort of, push themselves away from China and Huawei and 5G technology. They were far more open to it and not so warm against American advances. You did get, of course, the Anglosphere to sign on to this, and I believe a few nations in South America to do the same, but not many EU member states. That's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing is that throughout the summer of this year, not necessarily just between Belarus and Poland, but Belarus and Lithuania have also been experiencing an issue of migrants illegally crossing the border from Belarus into Lithuania. Politico earlier this year had reported that it was upwards of somewhere around over 5,000 migrants moving into this area, prompting border concerns and more of a push against Belarus and fortifying their own border, while also calling for Putin to help negotiate a settlement between the two countries. And so tensions between those two nations remain relatively tense. However, when it comes to the Chinese, the other thing to keep in mind is that China has been invested both in the Balkans, particularly in terms of providing foreign direct investment into Serbia, Montenegro, Baltic states that, of course, are needing infrastructure to keep up both in telecommunications, internet access, the like. All of which, right, we've seen with Chinese sort of interest in Belt and Road Initiative countries about increasing investment in infrastructure, in energy, in telecommunications, things that you would need for a modern economy to be beneficial for China's sort of economic middle kingdom to come to fruition. But on top of this, right, has also been this rather tough stance that they're willing to talk, diplomatically and economically, but they're not willing to watch other European states toe sort of the Anglospheric line of defense and sort of containing China. As we know, earlier this year, the German military frigate, the Bayern, was meant to go to the South China Sea in July. Or yeah, I believe it was in July, or no, August, excuse me, in August. And the Chinese government had told them, no, you can't port here. They made its displeasure very public. The Bayern's mission was to support a U.S.-led call to maintain freedom of navigation in that area, which is increasingly dominated by the Chinese military. And do note that the Chinese has been dealing with the idea of freedom of navigation operations from the Americans for years. Both during the Obama administration, during the pivot to Asia in 2011, and now it is dealing with it more so not only from the United States, but from the Japanese, what of the Taiwanese self-defense forces it has, and it was supposed to be the Germans, but the Germans were turned away. So on top of the fact that Lithuania has opened an office for the Taiwanese for diplomatic relations, and China responding in kind to reduce its diplomatic status between Lithuania and the Chinese government, I see that the signals point towards support of sort of this, migrants as a weapon, weapons for hire, weapons to be flown out. Just pay a couple of $1,000s, we'll recruit you, and you can have an adventure somewhere in the Baltics and in the Balkans if need be, and where it goes. All of which, right, puts it in a position to assist Russia in its own ends as well, especially as it tries to increase its relationship with Germany, increase its relationship with France, the two major leaders of the European Union when it comes to funding and military and its politics that play a huge influence over that in Brussels. So I think that the signals do show us that China will probably, work in cooperation to help consolidate power for Russia against, sort of this Western-oriented, this American-oriented European Union that we've seen for the last at least 2 decades now.
Yeah, it'll probably be something related to economic investment and the idea of economic corridors and a 3 Cs block as they pitch it. But I haven't looked at, the latest view on Visegrad or 3 Cs initiative or any of that. I will say, though, that I expect Russia would want to would look very carefully at any of that because it's just their critical backyard. There's just no way around it. I mean, remember that by having things inflamed in this region, it's not just whether or not it could cause problems for Poland. It's not just whether or not it could cause problems for Belarus. It's specifically that it cuts off, as we talked about at the beginning of this discussion, there's the whole likelihood that it could cut off the corridor between Belarus and from Russia via Belarus to Kaliningrad, because there's essentially the little corridor that the Russian stuff would have to go through, and it has to pass through or along. It has to pass through the border with Lithuania, from Belarus through Lithuania to Kaliningrad, or from Belarus through Poland to Kaliningrad. And all of this stuff is happening right near where the shortest line is to draw there. So I think probably what's happening is that there are a bunch of players getting mixed up in there now, and they're looking at what could be going on. I have my suspicions that that the U.S. is keeping a close eye on this. We've got, however many soldiers that were just sent over from the British Defense Ministry. They got a small team of military engineers that were deployed to Poland's border. They claim that they're going to be exploring UK assistance to the NATO ally, with the ongoing migrant crisis. And in that respect, the quote unquote migrant crisis of a couple thousand, migrants who've been flown up there, or I don't know, something under 10,000 at this point, surely. It just provides cover for everybody, for all the parties concerned. So they don't have to say there's massing of military forces in this region because there's a power play that's about to be made against Russia or on behalf of Russia, whatever it might be, right? Instead, all the newspapers around the world can just show, the reason that you're hearing about this and the reason that soldiers are going is because migrants, right? But anyway, I see you brought up a map of the the Jagiellonian Three Seas Initiative idea.
Yes, and I mean this is meant in purpose to be a counter, or at least what has been described as a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which wishes to connect, already from the China-Pakistan economic corridor all the way up to Turkey to get access to the Mediterranean, and of course to increase economic integration and cooperation with Russia. Now, of course, this project has been talked about since 2015, so this is relatively fresh, and this is trying to include the Intermarium countries, or the Intermarium project as it's known, after the post Poland Lithuanian Commonwealth, and how that word has been used and thrown around. This is, of course, is meant to connect from the Baltic all the way down to the Balkans in order to get down here as well as out of the Bosphorus and into the Mediterranean Sea. And China, of course, wishes to try and get itself involved because they do want to get connected to Turkey. But as we talked about earlier, and after Semyagog's wonderful, discussion about this, let me see. Oh, that did not be. Well, that's not what I wanted. Because here we are. Here's Kaliningrad, where my cursor is going around, and then all the way down, because here's the Crimean Peninsula, and here's that spot, not next to Moldova and the other countries. You can already see who's being, cut out from the Russian sphere of influence and who is supposed to be involved, whether that's, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine in this initiative. So you can already see this like push to, focus themselves on Lithuania, to focus themselves on Belarus and Poland, all of which, right, have this vested interest in maintaining, Russia's military position, maintaining their position outside of the European Union and sort of their own counter to Russia's plans for economic integration, China's plans for economic integration, all of which, right, they wish to not see succeed for obvious reasons. And we can see this happen right now before our eyes. But I mean, I think that tells us right now with the migrant crisis that this isn't your sort of traditional, oh, woe is me, let's accept these migrants. We've been fed that narrative now for well over 6 years. I mean, I have I grew up in Germany, in middle school and high school as a kid. My father was in the military, and I have friends over there that will tell me that they've arrested certain people of certain backgrounds in my, like, what I would call home. People arrested with bombs and automatic weapons. It's almost as if, Semyagog's description that these people are mobile militias of peace is a very accurate description, especially to undermine this Western project that we have seen out of the European Union, NATO, and the United States for some time now. And I think that tells us that everything that we've outlined here, whether it's about China and Lithuania, Russia's interest for economic integration, the, putting troops and nuclear capable bombers out there inside of Belarus in order to defend sovereignty and to make sure that, certain populations get to where they need to go. And it binds the European Union to play by its own rhetoric and own rules. I believe that's one of the rules for radicals that Saul Alinsky will tell you is that you make your enemy live up to their own rules. And so now, this narrative about, oh, these poor migrants, oh, these poor people, they now have to, live up to the EU's own rules, which is why you can see the press go from thank you, Poland, for not bringing any more in to let them in, let them in, let them in.
And I would look at that map too at former Yugoslavia there on the other side of, Romania and Bulgaria and the rest. If I were Russia, I would basically kindle a little mess over there too. I mean, it has risks because the pretext of a mess there could just as easily be used as by somebody like a Soros or by the EU or by China or by the United States. If you destabilize anything and get it open, then it sort of, opens it to remaking, and the pretext has been provided. However, if I were Putin, I'd at least be looking at the possibility of creating serious embarrassments and headlines in that region, because you'd have the threat of the destabilization or an economic impact, negative economic impact, and the rest on the backside of that whole Three Seas or Intermarium, or the Visegrad Four, whatever it is now, would be kind of a core of that same idea. And remember that inter Marium idea never got off the ground because there are great powers that have issues with it. So, trying to do it today could cause some problems as well. But you have to remember that, looking at everything that's green there, um, Ukraine's right next to it, and Belarus is right there next to it, and certainly the NATO planners would like to push the defense framework further in that direction at Russia's expense. And I think just sort of the globo homo types would be interested in seeing that expanded, which is why they went after Ukraine in the first place. We've been looking at them moving to make the Ukraine a piece on their board for years now, and it continues to be one of these frozen conflicts. So look to Ukraine as well as Belarus. Remember Kaliningrad, and keep your eyes peeled for the possibility of some kind of fuss being created behind this block in the area of former Yugoslavia. And I'd imagine places like Bosnia Herzegovina, Serbia, would be ripe for that. There are a lot of people saying these days that we shouldn't have a Bosnia Herzegovina. It's its own little frozen compromise conflict. Things get very, very complex up there in that Balkan region, and China has invested quite a bit of money in there. And as we pointed out a little bit earlier, Soros, via his son, has taken out opinion page op-ed type things in the New York Times about the need to go into the Balkans as well. So if they continue to yank on these levers, I think you're going to see areas of the former Yugoslavia break loose a little bit too.
Oh, I would agree wholeheartedly. But as we enter the hour and 45-minute mark, I was thinking that this would be a good place to offer some concluding remarks, and then we can chill and give some announcements. And I don't know if those were your final complete thoughts. I know we've talked a lot in the last hour and a half, but do you have any predictions or anything that you might see in the foreseeable future?
No, just what I said. Bear in mind Kaliningrad. This has to do with Kaliningrad. And it also has to do, likewise, with all the various points where Russia has said, we're not going to defend everything. We're going to concentrate our forces in just a few of these areas that are sort of like, in terms of their strategic planner's view, they're like, these are the places where we at least want to have some presence. We can let go of everything else. And frankly, it's pretty expensive anyway. So let's concentrate our forces in these few areas. And if there were ever a hot war to break out, we'd have our necessary beachheads to start our processes. So it's going to be about Kaliningrad, definitely. It's going to be about Transnistria. I should have probably gone looking at headlines about that, but it's been pretty frozen. It's going to be about the role of Russia in the southern slopes of the Caucasus Mountains. So that runs from Abkhazia to South Ossetia over to what's going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And then the last thing is I'd look at the business of something breaking out in the Balkans as well, whether or not it's a matter of opportunism on the part of like a Soros group that says, well, let's just do it. We're rattling everything else at the same time, right? Or it may be something like Russia saying, are you sure you want to mess around in these areas? Because we can still pull a lever here that will cause a very real mess for you. But yeah, as basically what I said earlier, all I was doing was reiterating that. And that pretty much covers it for me, sir.
I'm in agreement with Semyagog that this plays a major role with Kaliningrad, and that straight line between Kaliningrad and its interests in the Balkans, especially as we looked at the topography about how that is a flat, wide open plain that has been discussed as a major, flashpoint for kinetic conflict between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Soviet Union, since the Cold War had really began, about military engagement between these two countries. And what we are seeing is an evolution of that conflict as migrants are now being used as sort of its own form of biological warfare. Because we know that billions of dollars have been spent by the European Union and their own national governments of member states trying to house, re-educate, resettle, and on very rare occasions, repatriate. And in doing so has weakened the body politic of various European states due to their own, ideas of no human being illegal, and that we can make them the new Germans, the new Frenchmen. And while Germany seems to be full steam ahead on this as sort of the, one of the more powerful and influential members of the European Union, we are seeing some resistance to that. But on top of Russia's own military interests and desires to maintain a buffer state, you are now going to see just how important those relationships are between nations and the leaders of those countries like Lukashenko and Putin, especially as they want to maintain stronger economic integration, and they will try their best to achieve it by any means necessary after 30 years of American, influence and going back on their promises when it comes to, we're not going to expand NATO. We're not going to expand the European Union. And lo and behold, we're bombing. We're accepting Eastern and former Soviet states into the European Union, former Iron Curtain countries into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I think that we're seeing a evolution of resistance in which it becomes harder and harder to resist when the very facets of that resistance is already inside your borders. And what may come, we don't know for sure. Although I would say keep an eye out on how everything plays out in Belarus will play a major role in Ukraine. And considering the military buildup there and the saber rattling from the West, especially in the United States, about what that's going to be, that this is something that you should not stop paying attention to, because this will play a major role in the next 3 to 6 months for sure. And those would be my final thoughts. So thank you all for listening in to this sort of back and forth lecture. I said I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll just move on to some announcements and shilling. Semiagog, you're more than welcome to stay for that portion. We always end the show with a little herpetology lesson. And is there anything that you would like to promote?
No, not at the moment. But if I may, I'd love to stick around for the frogs.
Then no, stay you shall. So present. So just some announcement news. So based off of how many people I saw commenting on Friday, I am setting up Entropy. So we can do that. That way we're not relying on Susan taking a significant chunk of your money if you so wish to donate and support the causes. I am not doing a live show next Sunday because for us Americans, that will be Thanksgiving holiday, and I will be spending it with my family. Although I do have something in mind for you guys. It will probably premiere on Sunday at the usual time if you're interested. December 4th will be a community event with patrons and channel members. It'll be a Saturday to incorporate all of the time zones and differences. And it'll probably be a movie night because I do have a couple of movies that I'd like to review and talk about in depth. And I think that you all will enjoy it. And then one of my longer videos that I have in mind, I think it'll be around 45 minutes, will be Politics and Masculinity, and it is slated for December 15th. I've given myself a deadline. And then this next week, if you're familiar with Alexander Adams and the wonderful people at Bournebrook Magazine, if you know him from Pharaoh's art streams and the Foundation stuff, then I'll be having a conversation with them this next week. It'll be good. And then the next video in the meantime, while I work on larger projects, will be the wonderful Substack readings that we've been doing, but this time with upper production quality. I've increased our intros and transitions and things like that. So a lot of work is happening in the meantime. But I can see everyone calling for the Frog of the Week, so let's get the music going. Oh no. There we go.
Mighty.
And the gentleman who also did Semiagog's stream intro did the wonderful Frog of the Week theme. For those of you who are new here, we always end the Sunday stream with a lovely new frog for us to talk about. And it'll be something that is a mainstay here. It's part of the brand. So this Sunday, we're talking about Dybowski's frog, one of the many Russian frogs inside of that wonderful country. It can be found on the Korean Peninsula, eastern Russia, and northeastern China. They are particularly adaptive to their human development and environment. Despite loss of habitats, they have still managed to adapt well into suburban and agrarian regions of human development. Although their populations are primarily threatened in northeastern China, because they are used for medicinal purposes, both for a variety of herbal and traditional medicines in that area. It was discovered in 1856 by a Polish gentleman, I believe by the name of Alexander Dabowski. It can be fully grown up to about less than 3 inches in length, so about 5 to 7 centimeters, although the females can be as large as about 3.1 inches because they're a sexually dimorphic species. The women are always larger. And they have a hibernation period of September through late March. And then usually around the springtime is when mating and breeding season will start. The males have an internal vocal sac right below their pointed snout and their forward-looking eyes, making them more predatory and insectivore-oriented. And they are known for their brown and yellowish colors on tops with smooth skin and a very bright white belly. And that is the frog of the week, Dabowski's frog, and it happens every Sunday after we conclude our discussion and lecture on geopolitics and international relations. So if you don't learn something from the lecture, at least you'll learn something about amphibians at the end. And then, so last but not least, I'll just catch up with the one super chat that came in. And thank you to the 4 patrons that I have up here who provide $20 a month or more. Mr. Semiagog's links are down in the description, as well as my own. So if you can support Mr. Semiagog and his work, I recently signed up to his Subscribe Star. If you can do the same, go for it.
Based Praetorian behavior. In return, I must say that if anybody came over from my channel, most of you will already know the Prudentialist, who has been a guest on my channel, and he's a part of the whole academic agent crew and a great guy in general. If there is anyone who came over having heard about this from my end, please do click the subscribe button for more of this great content and to show your support for the peeps.
Well, thank you, Semiagog. And not to mention, besides this, every Sunday, you'll also get wonderful fishing videos and more stuff like that to come in the near future. But I know that there was one super chat coming in. So this was from Yeeter Skeeter from $5 Canadian. Thank you so much. He says, Croatian police have arrested a German journalist for aiding illegal migrant crossings into Croatia from Bosnia. So I suppose, Semiagog, we might have to take a look at that in the future about migration down in there. But no, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. And as you all know, and as I said on Friday's stream, none of this money stays in my hands. I use it to pay for my anti-rejection medication. I'm a transplant patient. I like the new kidney I have. So I like to keep it going. You guys make my medication virtually at no personal cost to me. So I'm greatly thankful for it. Plus all the books and the StreamYard subscription that I have, you guys cover that. So you keep me going and you keep the channel going. So I'm incredibly thankful. Not to mention that there's merch down below. So if you like the lovely image of the frog of the week right there, it's all there at the link tree down below for your viewing pleasure. But yeah, Semiagog, thank you so much for wanting to come on. I know that it was just a last week request, but I thought that this would be a fun topic for both of us to discuss since you have a very strong both historical and geographic understanding of the region, which I thought your point about Kaliningrad was just fantastic.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm always happy to come on. My buddy Tim is still dealing with all kinds of hospital stuff, and he's the main person that I would talk to about geopolitics. So, in fact, you're doing me a great favor because I have not been following it as closely, and you are doing so. And so it's great for me. I can come in and sort of catch up on all the latest things because you are sharing, both the top points of what appears in the news as well as, considerable analysis. So it's actually, you're doing me the favor, man. Thanks very much.
Well, no problem. There was a question in the chat that I thought would be a fun time for both of us to answer. I believe his name was Hans, and he had asked, so where do you guys learn about geopolitics? I'm having a hard time catching up. And Semiagog, I know that you've got a lot of emphasis on maps and symbols, so I was wondering, how did you start getting your understanding and how to put all the pieces together?
Well, years ago, through my friend Tim, who always insisted that I look at the world as a go board, not a chessboard, and who walked with me on my channel through many of the different regions and his knowledge of the issues, which goes back much, much further than mine. He was paying attention to this starting in the 1960s. I started paying attention in the 90s, so that a lot of it is just talking to people who've been paying attention for a while because they simply have they have more background with it. So, I don't know that you were watching the news in the 1990s when the Chinese embassy was bombed in Belgrade. So, you might read about it if you come across it, but it didn't come across your radar at the time. Likewise, for me, I learned a lot from Tim in that respect. And then, he recommended the maps that you mentioned. Always try to anchor it with the relationships in space, because many of the positions, they never change. If you know that the trans-European plane that you pointed out, that is kind of like a highway back and forth, usually a highway that involves smashing Poland on the way out and then smashing Poland on the way in, as the Poles will tell you. They certainly know. If you know that that trans-European plane has always been there, you know that it doesn't matter if you're talking about Napoleon or Hitler or geopolitical security concerns today. That territory is still going to behave more or less in the same way. It might become less important to be able to block the straits at the Bosphorus if you've got pipelines, but the position on the map is still going to generally behave in the same way, because most of these power relationships do not change over these centuries. So the first thing is to try to get a historical background. And if you don't have that, try to get it. A great channel for that is Apostolic Majesty's excellent historical channel, which I recommend everybody subscribe to, because he tries to take these blocks of historical periods and knit them together into wholes over time, to complete wholes. And then the other beautiful thing about that channel is that, unlike a lot of what you see on YouTube, I can't even speak today. It does not cease being relevant, because he's talking about historical periods, where the sort of most of the thinking about what happened has been done, and so you can form that background historically. Then there's the maps with the geopolitical relationships and the strategic relationships, and then only then do you turn to looking at the headlines in order to sort of position whatever you can find against that background, and that would be sort of, in short, the quick approach to it. Pay attention to the maps, pay attention to the history, and pay attention to the fact that the most important geopolitical or geostrategic realities don't change.
Well, Han says, thank you for the answer. To give you my perspective, and I've talked about this before, I kind of fell in love with it when I picked up George Friedman's 2009 book, The Next 100 Years, when I was in high school. I picked it up like a year after its publication in 2010, and it changed the way I viewed the world. And this was someone who'd been politically interested in the U.S. and things like that since like 2004 as a kid, because my dad was in the military. But the idea of understanding maps and history and demography and culture all changed my way of looking at the world. And so that really changed the way that I wanted to understand things. So I would always pay attention to maps, and I would pay attention to which countries have which resources. So throughout high school and then into college, I studied international relations, because that was something that I wanted to learn more about. And I did. I got a degree in political science to focus on international relations. And this was my plans back before being a lawyer. But every book that I was ever told to read in class, I would always buy and I would read through. And I've got now a huge library of stuff, so I'm far more bookwormish on it. But that's why I try and talk to people that who aren't American, who aren't, from what you would call sort of the West. And you can kind of really see that when I try and interview people, or I get different perspectives. I have patrons from all over the world. And so I like always, asking them or messaging them and saying, hey, well, what do you think about this? What's going on here? Because I think to understand this, you have to understand how to piece together, geography, the mineral resources of a country, the demography, their, cultural identity. What do the elites of that country particularly think? And what is the national interest? And that's always a loaded question. And that's where you get different schools of thought about international relations. As I've said, I am a structural realist, a neo-realist. I think that nations pursue hegemony and that the world is innately anarchic and crazy. And, there's no global sovereign. So it's always going to be one country pursuing interests over another or acting defensively. So that was my perspective, is that I started reading and I fell in love with it, all of which. So That's how I got into it. It was just I read, and then I really started paying attention to the world differently. And like Semyagok and his wonderful recommendations, you cannot understand this without understanding, maps and geography. And that's why it's called geopolitics, because geography uber alles in this situation. If you know the maps and the history, you can make some pretty accurate predictions based off what's happened in the past and what you can see happening before your eyes. And I've learned so much throughout this last year, courtesy of Apostolic Majesty. I studied American history for my 2 degrees and things such as that matter. So, and getting these long historical, plots of time and how they all interconnect and interweave is vital. So if you're not subscribed to him, out of everyone who's in this conversation right now, go subscribe to him, because you will learn, and those lectures are in depth. So thank God for the Pasta Posse for doing what they're doing.
Yeah, the mighty Pasta Posse. And I just want to underline what you said about talking to people from the place. That's enormously important. Whenever possible, try to talk to somebody who's from Belarus. Try to talk to somebody who's from Poland, just to hear what they have to say about it. That's probably the most important thing in terms of filling out. If you think of the maps and the history as the skeleton, then you go talk to people who are from that place, who are going to know all sorts of things that you never even would have heard about or thought of. Obviously, that would seem to be something that you should do, but a lot of people forget. Hell, a lot of times I even forget, and I'll come up with some hypothesis, and then someone will just drop in and be like, you're cute and everything, but you're not from here. And so you're not familiar with the background. Allow me to disabuse you of your misapprehensions. So yeah, talk to the people from the places.
And I have Mr. Majesty's channel in both the chat, and I have it on here on screen. So if you're not subscribed, go learn some history, go subscribe to him. But yeah, I mean, if you're not learning from other people from other countries, one of my favorite things is this just sort of motivational poster where it just shows this globe and the United States, Alaska, Hawaii, and it's just like, hey, this is not just the world. And while we're uniquely isolated as Americans, one of the greatest pleasures that you can have in life is being well-traveled and associated with people of different cultures. Mr. Semyagog had lived in Turkey for some time. I grew up overseas as a military brat. I got to live in Germany. I got to visit and live in parts of the United Kingdom, and seeing different cultures and such, all of which is going to help your perspective around the world. And that's something I think more Americans especially need to do, is to be well-traveled. So with all that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you, Semyagog, so much for coming on. I'm so glad that all of you could tune in for our discussion today. And if you didn't miss last week's episode, I had a discussion with 2 Polish nationals who gave us their own perspective on that. So if you wish to see that, there will be more to come. And then when the stream ends, it'll redirect you to Monday's discussion I'm having with Mr. Astral from astralflight.substack.com on the issue of Spengler in Decline of the West, Volume 2. So I hope to see you all then. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care, everybody, and be prudent.